Okay, so just to give you a quick glimpse of what we'll be talking about today, I want to talk a little bit about why we developed this tool. I will talk a little bit about some of the components and the mapping history with the Vermont Wetland Rules, and then we'll actually go over the screening tool. So the purpose of this tool is really to provide the best information that we have, and to also do that in a way where you don't have to be a mapping expert. It actually takes a little bit of learning and skill to interpret maps. So we're trying to do that for you as much as possible and give you a prompt to what should our next step be? Do we need to contact a district wetlands ecologist? Should I just skip that and go get a delineation? So that's sort of the purpose and need. And the reason for that is that we have been closely tied to the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory maps, which here is shown outlined in yellow, but that really only tells a little bit of the story. So that same VSWI is here in blue. We have an advisory wetland mapping that shows wetlands possibly being all up and down this watershed, and then this purple is the hydric soil. So we want to give that information in a way that makes sense and gives people the best possibility of discovering if there are wetlands on their property. So one of the big reasons for this is that we had a rule change in 2010 that allowed for us to take jurisdiction not just over those wetlands mapped on the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory maps, but also those that are like those. And I'll go over a little more detail what those kinds of wetlands look like. But it basically meant that there was a subset of wetlands that we would consider jurisdictional that do not appear on the Vermont Significant, on the VSWI maps. And as I mentioned before, it's something that we want to be able to provide to somebody so they don't have to have a certain skill level or contact somebody with a certain skill level. Some of those skills are knowing what layers to turn on, interpreting what those layers mean, understanding that there's a little bit of an inherent inaccuracy in the mapping, and there's all kinds of other tools out there that we want to incorporate into our mapping, like LiDAR and photo interpretation. And some of the layers that we have actually already do that. So we want to make sure that the public has access to that. And really the kind of user group that we're aiming towards aren't necessarily the consultants and the engineers and the folks that regularly use our mapping program, but to people who are, this is their first time needing to look at a certain property in the context of whether or not there's a wetland on that property. So realtors, town officials, landowners, potential property buyers. These are all people that we're aiming towards. I have to give a shout out to Eric Engstrom. He's our GIS person. He's a complete wizard and a hero. And he and Danielle Arzowski, who they developed a tool that basically was able to do an inquiry on a piece of property, look at the different natural resource layers, and let people know who to contact to see if that was an issue. And I believe that was actually aimed specifically at folks doing watershed grant applications. So that's been really useful. That's actually been elevated up into a permit screening tool, and they kind of leapfrogged us, but we're in the midst of making this tool as well, which is, I said, that's nice, but that's not the whole picture. We want all these layers, and that's kind of how this came about. We have both mapping and database resources on hand, and new mapping products are being developed. So we wanted to make sure that this tool incorporated all of those things. So I'd be remiss to talk about mapping in Vermont as pertains to wetlands without talking a little bit about the history. And our regulations are closely tied to mapping. Our original mapping came from the National Wetland Inventory maps Those were taken from aerial photos that were taken in the 1970s, either at a 1 to 40,000 or 1 to 80,000 scale. Somebody went through Mylar by Mylar and traced out where they could see wetlands on the aerial photos, and those were made into the NWI maps and eventually adopted into the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory maps. Those NWIs were not originally created for a regulatory purpose. They were really created to create an inventory to detect wetland loss over time. But when the wetland rules were adopted in 1990, we had done a study looking at those NWIs in the context of our rules, which are created to protect the functions and values of those wetlands. And what we found was that at least 93% of the wetlands that appeared on the NWI maps had at least one function or value that was worth protecting. So it was a real quick and easy way to say, we're protecting wetlands, here's where they are. That study didn't really go into what the protected functions of non-mapped wetlands were. But those VSWIs stood as a basis of jurisdiction from 1990 to 2010. So the wetlands that we protect are Class 1 wetlands, which are the highest level of quality and merit some, special protection. They have a 100-foot buffer zone. Most of the wetlands in landscape that we protect are Class 2 wetlands. They have at least one function or value that's worth protecting. And then those wetlands that are neither Class 1 or Class 2 wetlands are considered Class 3 and are not protected by our rules, but maybe still be protected by federal or local agencies. With the 2010 rule change, we went from not just protecting VSWI mapped wetlands or those contiguous to those mapped wetlands, but any wetlands greater than 1/2 an acre, any wetlands that may be under 1/2 an acre that are adjacent to a stream, lake, pond, or river, vernal pools, special and unique wetlands like bogs and fens, headwaters above 2,500 feet in elevation, and wetlands that are adjacent to impaired waters. So what we found was that these types of wetlands have the function and value that merit protection according to the Vermont wetland rules. So we needed to kind of move beyond the VSWI because there are these subset of wetlands. About 30% of what we're regulating doesn't appear on the VSWI. By just using the VSWI, there was a little bit of a false sense of assurance. Well, that VSWI appears on my neighbor's property, but not on my property, so I must be okay. Well, those wetlands are not accurately mapped. They come from aerial photos from 40 years ago or more. So it's an aged mapping product. It's a lot of times people are transferring the VSWI onto a site plan thinking that that's good enough. All of these wetlands on any of the maps that we have require some kind of determination in the field of where the actual boundary is. And because these are tied, the VSWI are tied to our regulations, there's a really cumbersome process to add and subtract wetlands from that mapping product. So there's a little bit of a different aspect to mapping, not for jurisdiction or for regulation, but simply mapping for identification purposes. To do this, we're able to use the VSWI, but we add on to it. We have different layers that may not have the same, quality, but they may provide really good information that will at least, help guide where we should be looking on the ground. We can also very nimbly add and subtract things from maps that are not tied to regulations. So if we have a big mapping update that comes in, NWI comes out with a new map, we're doing EPA funded mapping projects in different watersheds in the state, those can automatically be put on these non-VSWI layers. And then, yeah, and we don't have to go through any sort of process to add or subtract to that. We can just have that product available. So beyond the VSWY, one of the best layers that we have is this wetland advisory layer. And this is a product of town mapping that happened, I think it was in the 2000s, so like 2000 to 2010, I think it all happened before the rule change. And there was some funding that came out through the Regional Planning Commission that was given to different towns to update their local maps for local zoning purposes mainly. And so there are a handful of towns that have this advanced mapping. It was the same kind of structure that NWI happened with. So there was aerial photos, but they were newer aerial photos. And there was a certain level of ground proofing in a lot of those towns. So those got added to the advisory map. There's watershed mapping, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And then there's wetland program mapping. So information that we might have from our site visits, from our bioassessments, those can be added to the advisory layers when we can do that. So the really exciting mapping projects going on out in the world right now for our program is this NWI Plus project. The first pilot project was the Missisquoi River Basin. And it basically creates a model, and there's some ground proofing that went along with this with a very detailed mapping product that talks about, these are all Cawertian codes that represent the type of wetlands. So PFO, for example, is a palustrin forested wetland, but it also talks about whether, how the water's flowing, where the water's flowing. And so there's some really neat information that we're getting out of this particular product. And we worked with St. Mary's University of Minnesota on this and did the ground proofing aspect of it. So these are much more detailed and updated maps. And the Otter Creek watershed has been completed, and it should be added to the advisory map in 2021. And then coming up next is the Winooski watershed. So we've been applying for and getting these watershed grants through the EPA to do these updated mapping models. This also incorporates things like LIDAR, field data, and much newer imagery. So these tend to be more accurate than the VSWI in terms of detecting wetlands in the landscape. The other product that has always been out there and is still out there is the NRCS soil maps. The Natural Resources Conservation Soils mapping is for the USDA, so it's a very agriculturally oriented product. The level and detail of mapping tends to be greater in areas of agricultural areas. So as you move up into the landscape, into the mountains, the maps are a little bit coarser. But what we found is that there's a basic label that says whether or not a soil is hydric or not. And some hydric soils are much more hydric than others. So we did some splitting within this group that's been actually really useful. So if you have a very hydric soil, or what we're calling an obligate, taking from the plant more than obligate hydric soil, it's things like mucks, peats, marsh, emergent wetlands, and this is even in the description of the soil name, Pondasqueak mucks, or Pondicherry mucks, or different peatlands. So these are typically, what I have found is that these are very well mapped. The NRCS was like, this really isn't a great place to plant. You shouldn't do anything here. So those particular ones seem to be very, very accurate. And then there are some wetlands that are a little bit more hydric than others as well. And then there are just sort of the run-of-the-mill hydric soils, which may have inclusions, and they tend to be coarser soil units, but they can be really helpful depending on the landscape position that you find them in. The other wealth of information that we have is wetland projects. Our program has been in existence since 1990. And these are points on the map, basically saying that we've been out there and we've looked at something, but you can also tell whether or not we've issued a permit. You can tell whether or not we've made a call on classification and when that was. If it was before 2010, we have a little warning that pops up that says this was called Class 3 in 2010. With the rule change in 2010, this may be considered Class 2. You should really have somebody take a look. Some of the projects also have delineations on file, so if you come across a parcel that has a project associated with it, it's always good to check into our office. We have digital information, I think, available from 2013 till the present. Projects before that are not digitized yet, but we just are hoping to get those digitized. That's our, our other goal in life is to get all that information so it's digitally available. And there's usually a decision of, it's usually the projects are, we want to do something. Is there a wetland there? Is there not? So that's one piece of information. What is the classification of the wetland? That's the other piece. And then if you have a permit, there's going to be all kinds of decisions and permitting conditions that are part of that. And if there's a permit, there is definitely going to be a delineation as well that will help inform you about what's going on the site. Another gem we have is natural community mapping. This was created by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Non-Game Natural Heritage Program. Most of the information is located on state-owned land, but there's more than 50 wetland natural community types. So you can not only find those will pop up as a layer, but you can also figure out what those are by clicking on that layer. So it will tell you that it's, red maple, ostrich fern, floodplain forest. I don't think that's actually a type, but it sounds good. So that's good information to have. There is some private land that has the same mapping that they've been able to do with permission. And so then the other question is, well, what if nothing's mapped? Does that mean there's no problem? Not always. We tend to have a proceed at your own caution. This is a good example. This was a property in Cambridge that had absolutely nothing mapped, no hydric soils. It's high up in the landscape, so there wasn't a whole lot of detail on the hydric soil mapping up there. There's no VSWI, but when they did the delineation, all of this checkered area is all wetland, so most of the property was wetland. What we do have is a landowner's guide to wetland that kind of gives you an overview of how to maybe have your own little checklist of in the field of whether or not this area might be wetland. So when people come to me and say, oh, we're able to mow this, late summer, it must not be wetland. I'm like, why aren't you mowing it earlier? Well, it's too muddy and my lawnmower will get stuck, or my driving mower will get stuck. So there's all kinds of different ways to ask this question of, what do you have for vegetation? Is water present? How long is it there? And, I think that just because it isn't on the map doesn't necessarily mean it's not wet, and there always needs to be a field component, an on-site component to some of these yes or no questions of whether or not a wetland's present. And even with the best mapping, like I said, it'll never replace groundproofing for wetland boundaries. And some of those reasons are that wetland boundaries can change over time. We have a limit on how long a delineation is good for. It's for about 5 years, especially when things like beavers move in. We would need to recheck those boundaries. Like I said, about 30% of our workload is for unmapped wetlands. There's certain wetland types that just are really hard to detect on maps. Softwood forested wetlands are really hard to detect because of the aerial component. You're not able to see the hydric soil underneath. There are some other types that are also pretty hard to see unless you're on the ground. And then there are some funny things that do get mapped as wetlands that aren't actually wetlands. There's more, I think, all of the sewage lagoons throughout the state are mapped as wetlands, and that's not something we're going to take jurisdiction over. The next steps, if you do think there is a wetland, is usually to contact the ecologist and figure out where to go from there. We do provide our own desktop reviews. This is, this time of year, I'm in the office 2 days a week and out 2 days or 3 days a week. So we want this tool to kind of provide some of that desktop review for somebody who needs an answer quickly. But we do site visits. We look at project planning material and answer questions, and we do that all the time. The alternative is also to hire a wetland consultant, and all this information is on our webpage. I can provide that for you. Okay, so I'm going to hop off this and then show my desktop, and we will actually cruise through the screening tool. Turn on the chat. Oh, good. Fun. Okay. I'm going to start at the top here. We'll cover that.
Yeah, and it's that you can use someone else's. I was just giving some good examples. So you
Well,
can
I'm going to use yours. I'm going to use yours first, just because it's likely to have something good. Okay, so can folks see my screen? Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So this is the screening tool. It looks pretty unassuming, but you either want to type in an address or a span number. I was pretty adamant about using span numbers because a lot of these properties may not have a 911 address if they don't have a dwelling on them. So when you type in, when you go for the search, there's a couple places, there's a couple things to see. So there's going to be pop-ups for each one of the mapping layers that I've talked about. So this particular one is, there's a wetland permit associated with this property. So if you were to click on, well, what does that mean? Each one of these layers has its own PDF that shows up and talks about what's going on. And so it talks about hey, there's something permanent on here and you probably need to contact the program. Talks about what the layer is, where it came from, the regulatory meaning of it, the level of accuracy, and then there's all kinds of links of interest. So each one of those layers is going to have that same sort of pop-up. The way this works is based on the actual property boundaries as opposed to a point on the property. So this one says there's an issued permit within 1,000 feet of this location. So that's interesting. So let's see what this is going to look like on the map. Okay. So we've got 115 Sand Hill Road. We've got, this is the parcel boundary here. It looks like there is a mapped wetland right adjacent to it. So even though this isn't showing something on this particular parcel at this moment that's mapped as wetland, as an ecologist, downloading my brain into this program, it's like, well, this has my spidey senses tingling because there's a wetland right next to it. Wetlands aren't polite. They don't follow parcel and property boundary lines. So it's probably something I should check out. Let's go back. So it looks like the adjacent property also had a permit. See if we can find where that is. That's probably right there, 2019, 687. So there's some good information, at least on this part of the property, that will give probably a delineation. This looks like it's actually, based on what I know, probably the delineation that got picked up and added to the VSWY when this permit came in. So yeah, so this also has the VSWY on here, and it talks about what that is. So you could do a pop-up in here too. Okay. And let's see what else we got for. Zap, did you want to say anything about that property?
Nothing specific other than I wanted to give you an example where there was a permit that was actually issued, and you were correct, Shannon, the VSWI layer came out of the delineation that was done on the parcel, which previously did not have as much VSWI shown.
Okay.
That has been updated through ground truthing.
Okay, good. Okay. 642 Fish Pond Road, Newberry. So I want to point out some of the other things on here. This does actually give you the contact information too for the ecologist in the area. If you click on this, I believe that takes you to Julie's email. Let's just see. Do that later. So you can do this as well, which I think it says you can generate a map to send to Julie to talk about this project. This one has some fun things going on. So this is the differentiated soil mapping. So the muck is showing up as a little bit of a different color than the Cabot silt loam. I find in my district, Cabot silt loam, it's about a 50-50 chance it's wetland. It's one component of 3 that we would need to look at. And because it's a coarser mapping unit, it's really what's happening with the soils on the ground that tells you whether or not it meets the hydric soil criteria. But this does give us enough of a warning that it's probably something that we should take a look at. So there's a really nice muck unit. I don't know how much you guys have navigated around this mapping tool, but you can dim these layers and make them more opaque to kind of see what's going on underneath. And it looks like there's some, a stream running through, nice forested wetland. But, if we were just to look at the VSWY map here, we would be missing all of this muck unit, which is very likely also wetland based on what we're seeing. So let's go back to the tool, see what that says. So there's a permit associated with the property. There's a VSWY map. There's a VSWY map off property. And there's this obligate soil unit. Hydric soils are 1 part of 3. These soils are very hydric, meaning it's probably very, very likely that those are going to be considered wetland. And we can go into the hydric soil layer and talk a little bit about, get some information about what that means. Okay. See if we can find. Oh, Molly's Bog. Let's do that one. That's my district. I'd rather not do my district because it will probably mean more work for me later on. So let's take a look. And I'll do a span too, just so you guys see what that looks like, but it's basically the same results. So there's a wetland permit associated with this property. There was a wetland project created within 500 feet. And there was another permit. But this is interesting because there's no hydric soil or anything showing up, but let's just take a look. Let's get a little pokey here.
Catch up on it.
Okay, so that's it. So if we zoom out, maybe. This is a little glitchy. Can't zoom out. But we do see there's a property nearby. Oop. Yep, there we go. Okay. So it's always good to look out a little bit further. It may be that this is the property that probably has the wetlands on it and the permit on it, 1991, 495. So that wouldn't surprise me. I think this is the big Molly Bog area here. Borehemist is a soil unit that shows up as a very hydric soil. And I think this is the natural community mapping here. So I think that this is actually Molly's Bog over in here. But we can always click on that, see. See what it comes up as. Significant natural community, red maple sphagnum basin swamp. Cool. There's a rare and protected species. That's the VSWY. That's the significant natural community. So this inner layer over here is the black spruce woodland bog. So, for this particular property, it may be that these things come up. There's no hydric soil. There's no actual mapping near here. This may be just fine, but we do want people to be aware. If it were this property, we would definitely want to go out and look at where the wetland boundary is, because it's obvious that it would, kind of creep up being so adjacent. But because there is like a 300 or 1,000-foot buffer on some of these more sensitive areas, it does pop up over here. So the entire purpose of the tool is really to give people a heads up. And I think it does a pretty good job of accomplishing that. Okay, well, I want to make sure that I leave time for questions. I'll do one more down in Brattleboro, but feel free to hop on and type in any questions that you might have, or raise your hand and we can answer those by chatting as well. Oops. Let's see. Okay. So we've got permit and we've got a VSWI. Let's see what this looks like. Guess I didn't feed the hamsters in my computer enough. Lunch, everything's moving slow. Okay. So it looks like there is a project adjacent to this property, and there is a mapped pond adjacent to this property. One of the things that you can do with these. Yeah. One of the things that you can do is you can actually click on this project star and get some more information. Let me just see if I can. I don't think it's going to let me get in here in a timely manner. Okay. One of the things you can do is pop that up, and that will give you, it will give you some information like when the permit was issued, but it's really that 2020-260, that number up here. That's the number that you want if you're going to inquire about information about that permit. So the information that we do get, so the public is publicly accessible. So you can get a copy of the application, you can get a copy of the permit, and the application will include a set of plans and a delineation that shows where that wetland is. Even if you own the adjacent property, or you're looking at the adjacent property, the delineation may show, you know, the wetland going up to the boundary with an indication that it keeps going. So that would be good information for you to have, even if the property in question isn't the one that has the permit on it. Okay, so great. So any questions for me? Any questions about the tool or the rules or the program?
We do have a question in the chat about how soon are online maps updated after an ecologist visits property for wetland assessment.
So the only the wetlands that we definitely add to the maps are the ones that have a permitting decision and a determination decision to them. So those are added to the VSWY maps. Because we look at hundreds of properties a year, we don't have the capacity to do an update in the advisory layer for every property that we look at. Oftentimes we may give, we will record what will show up eventually. And we are committed to having this done usually by March of the following year, is that there will be a project number created and there will be information within that project. So if we've sent out an email or a sketch, or we have these preliminary determination forms that we give to people sometimes, the file will have that information. So because Vermont has a very short growing season, there isn't a good system for real-time updates, where I go and robotically process every site visit I've been to this week on Friday. Instead, sometimes these projects, get recorded and we take notes and we need to move on to the next one. So that's kind of explains where we're at.
Thank you. We have another question. Are the permit documents available through public records?
That is something you would need to inquire about from us. Usually it's something, especially if it's a more recent permit, that we have that information digitally and we can send to you. Some of the older permits, right now we're in a little bit of a state of flux for some of our regions. But it requires basically hunting down the paper project. So that might take a little bit longer if it's an older project. And because delineations are only good for 5 years, it's going to give you limited information. And we might just say the best way to approach this is just to have, the area re-looked at again.
Thank you. We can wait a few more minutes. Anybody have any more questions they want to put in the chat, or I'd like to invite anybody who would like to raise their hand and ask their question verbally. You can do so and we'll call on you. Bill Elder. Oh, you're muted, Bill.
Oops, still muted. You're gonna have to press on your little microphone there. Let's see if I can unmute you.
Nope. Amira? Sorry.
Okay. Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, Bill.
The question arises numerous times as far as wetlands. Are loggers exempt from going through swamps and brooks, hauling out logs and making a mess?
Well, that's a whole other lunchtime presentation, but
I guess so.
yeah,
that happens a lot, and that tributary that they maul through ends up in a lake here at Tickle Naked Pond in Reigate.
God, I love that name. The answer to that question is there is an allowed use for silvicultural activity, but only that follows the acceptable management practices put forth by the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. So there's a whole guide on how to do silviculture in a way that doesn't impair water quality.
Well, I went to the St. Johnsbury district office, talked to Matt Langless, and he referred me to somebody else and phone numbers. And I called them a couple times and none of them responded.
Okay.
So the question comes back to, is there any real enforcement of loggers logging something and wallowing through mud and brooks and beaver ponds and not taking corrective action? And what enforcement is there to stop the operation.
Right, yeah. So I know that it's usually FPR that takes the lead on those, but if for some reason they don't have a jurisdictional hook, so usually it's people that are in the current use program that they're able to take, have more jurisdiction over. If there's a situation where somebody's mucking about, you can call our program directly and report it, or there's a reporting system for violations through the agency as well that may get a quicker response than trying to call people this time of year, just because we're out and about, and that will be seen by the people that need to see it. So in that situations, in that situation, it sounds like it would be seen by someone in our wetlands program who covers that area, and probably maybe even a stream person too. So I would recommend that.
Who would be the Caledonia County representative to enforce that?
The enforcement officer for that area, I think, is Reg Smith. But you'd have to look at the map, and then Julie
Well,
follows.
I think he's one of the ones that I called and I never got a response back.
Yeah. So it might, that's why I'm saying it might be better to file it through the website. Because that way it's on record, and it won't, it won't just be a missed phone call.
Don't loggers have to go through preliminary to let the forestry management people know that they're going to be harvesting in a swamp, bog, brook, beaver ponds before they take action, before they
No.
start operation? There's no
No.
requirement for that?
No, there's no requirement for that, but they do have to follow the AMPs. It is a violation of the wetland rules if they're doing this in a way that also violates the AMPs. So in a situation where it's that wet, the AMP would really be to do it in either a dry part of the year, to not go through the wetland, or to do it in a frozen part of the year where they can go through without causing damage.
Thank you for your question, Bill. We'd like to leave some time for some other questions. Amara, apologies if I'm getting your name miscorrect.
You're actually saying it correctly, Amara. Most people say it Omira, which my father-in-law will roll over in his grave. I want to go back to the assessments. I'm the person asking the assessments and when things show up on. Okay, so if there's a permit request on on property that you're visiting, is that available more quickly than the following March?
Yes.
Public?
Yeah.
And how would we find that? Because we just need to know what's going on with the land that I would love you to look up next. And several people have typed in Stevens Place, Wells River.
Okay.
On the list.
So unfortunately, I do need a 911 address, which is why I skipped through that one.
It's I think I typed it in afterwards. It's like 487, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen and look that up. We can kind of talk about this in the context.
Yeah, and people in the town are very concerned because we want to be able to keep up with the process, if you will.
So what was it, 487?
Stevens with a V, Place, Wells River, Vermont. Well, obviously Vermont.
Okay, so that's not showing up.
Okay, why is that? It's 280 acres.
It may be, this is something you need to look up with a span number. And that is sort of the.
Hold on, my husband's yelling. What did you say, love? 487 is what she put in. Okay, sorry. A Wells, it's Wells. It's a Wells with an S, river.
So sometimes if there isn't an assigned, if this
Well,
is an undeveloped parcel,
Nope, there's a former B&B on it in a garage, and
is Wells River the actual town name, or is that a?
it's actually in Newbury.
Okay, let's try that.
Shannon, I just put the span number into chat.
Thanks. We'll try this.
Ah,
So it looks like there is a wetland nearby.
so there's a new assessment that's going to be taking place, so that's what we're,
Let's see if this works any bit better.
and another question that I have is abutting landowners, because the closest abutting landowner has, and it's a growing beaver dam, and it's just growing and growing, and that would be on Bears Den Road, but it's the closest to this property.
Mhm. So this is the number that
Yes,
you would want, the 2021-337. So that's the number. And that should have, I'll kind of show you how we do this, but. Oops. This is our internal database. But it would be easy enough to look this up, to ask the ecologist or our admin person to send you what they have. It looks like they haven't filed a permit yet. but
no,
they-
she's going out there on the 26th, I think.
Yeah, so she's
23rd.
Yeah, so she started a project number, so we probably don't have much right now. For stuff like this, what will happen when a permit is submitted is that there is the permit database. You can, if you think there is going to be a permit, you can ask to be put on the list of people that are interested. So there's a whole database that you would be automatically updated for any information. Going out.
Where's that list? Where would I find that?
I think common information. Let's see.
Oh. This land is actually kind of high, and they're going to damage a lot of the abutting land below it, which is a giant saffron farm and stuff
Right.
like that. So,
Yeah, I'll copy something into the link, or Zap, maybe you
Okay.
can look it up, but basically you can ask to be put on that list if they haven't started a permit yet.
mhm,
That's basically, there's nothing in there for that right now.
right.
But as soon as they start a permit, if you're an adjacent landowner, you'll get notified, and you can ask to be notified of future information. Oh, thank you, Laura Woods. The ENB database is the one, and I would talk more about that, but that also is its own lunchtime lecture series and is
Yeah.
super.
So just one yes
Super
or no.
excellent.
So all abutting landowners, if they get to the permitting process, all abutting landowners will be notified, even out of state abutting landowners, because that didn't happen.
It's based on the parcel information, I believe. So I believe that it is people that own property adjacent to that subject property, touching that subject property. So if
Yeah.
you're 2 properties away, you may not get notified.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the abutting landowners, the people that are
Yeah.
surrounding that land. Okay,
Thanks.
thank
Zach.
you. I don't mean to take up all the time. Sorry, thanks.
No, that's okay. It's yeah, the notification, like I said, the whole permitting process and notification. It's worth it looking at the ENB, that link that we sent, just so, because that also talks about like what that notification looks like, and when you should expect to be notified, how you can sign up for alerts in your area. how you can sign up for alerts for a specific project, and I don't make any guarantees about how user-friendly it is, as I sit here and stumble over, my use of it. But it is something that I think does have some fact sheets and some information that will help you out. Great. All right. Any other
Great.
questions?
No, we don't have any more questions in the chat, and we are at time. So unless anybody has another burning question, I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you, Shannon, for the wonderful presentation and demonstration of the tool. That was awesome.
Great. Thanks so much.
Have a good evening, everyone.